Oanga Hogan Benzagura Pema CD Hogan. Oanga Hogan Benzagura Pema CD Hogan. Okay, so thank you all for attending my part 2 of my series of talks on the Lotus Sutra. 4 main talks of the Lotus Sutra proper, 1 preamble and 1 epilogue. So today is part 2. We'll begin doing, hopefully, we'll just fill up the hour, but approximately it should be chapters 8 through 14 of the Lotus Sutra. I presume everyone's familiar with what we're doing, so I don't need to re-explain to anyone what we're doing. So the only issue now is I have to pry my talk away from under my cat. Just give me 1 second to do that. Come on, Sinji. It's okay. There we go. Oh, there we go. Okay. So anyone have any questions or comments before we begin? I think everyone here came from the first talk as well, so the first 2 talks. Okay, so let's just begin, carry on then. I'll try to keep my eye on the chat. Yos Yospe, what? Yos Yospe, you had a question? I see, really. No? No one spoke up when I asked if anyone needed an explanation what we're doing. Oh, Jules missed it. Okay, so do you know what we're doing, or should I re-explain? Okay. So does anyone need an explanation? Okay. So we're carrying on with chapter 8, the power of renunciation. Purna, son of Maitra, and please feel free to interrupt, to post your questions in the chat as they occur to you. I'll try and keep an eye on it. Purna, son of Maitrayani, one of the 10 disciples of the Buddha, noted for his eloquence, rises and praises the Buddha. The Buddha praises Purna too, declaring that next to himself, Purna is the most lucid. The Buddha predicts that he will become the Buddha radiance of the law Tathagata. The Buddha declares that his Buddha land will be as large as a Chiliocosm, wherein the gods will inhabit, quote, palaces in the sky, quote unquote. We have already noted the alternative translation of palaces as aerial cars, and the context makes it clear that here we are referring to a universe, not a planet. The sutra states that men and gods will behold each other in these celestial palaces. Interestingly, his Buddha land will have no females, because there will be no carnal passion. Presumably they will be spontaneously born, like the Devas in the Pali Canon. The inhabitants of Purna's Buddha land will be luminous and have the power of flight. The Buddha predicts the future destiny and Buddhahood of 1,200 adepts, and you may recall I'm using the term adepts in this talk to translate arhat. The adepts declare their realization that the adept's nirvana is unsatisfactory and that more remains to be done. The Buddha originally taught perfect wisdom, which is implicitly identified with Buddhahood, but the adepts settled for partial or incomplete nirvana because that was the easier path. Now they realize that adeptship is merely a prelude to Buddhahood, that is, the path of the wisdom being, and they declare, which is my translation of Bodhisattva, and they declare their aspiration to achieve the final real nirvana of complete and perfect Buddhahood. And that's all I have to say about chapter 8. Oh, we are coming up to a recap as well, so those of you who did miss part of the beginning, I will be reading a recap of what we've already done. So chapter 9 is the next chapter, Ananda's divine activity. The Buddha predicts the future Buddhahood of his disciples. Ananda will become the Buddha's sovereign, universal king of wisdom, greatest mountains and oceans, Tathagata. That's his name in Sanskrit. I'm not giving the Sanskrit, just the translations. Ananda's attainment of Buddhahood is his reward for an ancient vow to treasure the Dharma. The Buddha predicts that Rahula, which you may recall is the Buddha's only son, will become the Buddha on 7 jeweled lotuses Tathagata. The Buddha tells Ananda that 2,000 adepts will attain Buddhahood in the far future. And that does complete the Lotus Sutra up to the recap. So we're going to do a recap now of the previous chapters that we've already covered. And that will satisfy, hopefully, those who missed part of the previous talks as well. So recap, the Lotus Sutra is rooted in the Pali tradition and maybe even in the Pali or at least a similar Prakrit language. Although it appears extremely innovative, we know from the early Buddhist schools, that's my talk called the early Buddhist schools, that about half of the early Hinayana schools were moving toward a more imaginative understanding of the Dharma. The original stratum of the Lotus Sutra goes back to the 1st century before the Common Era, about the same time that the Pali Canon was first written down. The Lotus Sutra is highly revered by Mahayana Buddhists and has even been credited with triggering enlightenment in at least one receptive reader, who would be Hakuin Ekaku, who lived between 1686 and 1768, the reviver of the Rinzai school of Japanese Zen, while reading the 3rd chapter, which we've covered. That's the chapter called A Parable. Oh, that's the famous, I'm wondering if that's the famous burning house parable. Yes, that's the famous burning house parable. And 3 large themes have been identified in the Lotus Sutra. First, the ultimate unity of all teachings. Second, the primordial Buddha archetype. And third, the Bodhisattva vow, or bodhicitta, as the essential method of liberation. The lotus is a Buddhist symbol of body, speech, and mind. The lotus flower, or blossom, is an emblem of realization, untainted despite being rooted in the mud of samsara. Similarly, the wisdom being who is the Bodhisattva, of course, enjoys the fruits of realization, but remains involved in the world out of compassion for suffering beings. And there are 3 different interpretations of that, which we won't get into today. In the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha refers to himself as the Tathagata, a somewhat mysterious word, well translated by Hurwitz as the thus come one. That's the most succinct translation of it I've seen. I'm trying to think of the other translation. It doesn't come to mind right now. The Wayfarer is a very loose translation. The Lotus Sutra is the revelation of the essential mystery of the Tathagata, conceived in the interiority of his own enlightened mind. Thus, the Lotus Sutra is the direct manifestation of enlightenment itself, whereas the Pali Canon manifests enlightenment through the conditionality of unenlightened and samsaric experience. In fact, that is the essential difference between the Mahayana Sutras and the Pali Suttas. The Pali is from the perspective of unenlightenment, and the Mahayana Sutras are written from the perspective of enlightenment. Thus, the Lotus Sutra is radiant and ecstatic, whereas the Pali Suttas largely, though not exclusively, emphasize suffering and ignorance. This insight explains the essential difference of form between Hinayana and Mahayana. The Lotus Sutra declares itself to be Buddha Vachana, the authentic word of the Buddha, yet it is presented in an obviously trans-historical way, thus raising the question of what it means to be Buddha Vachana and the nature of reality itself. The phantasmagorical world of the Lotus Sutra is a fantastic Dharma display imagined from the perspective of direct realization. The Lotus Sutra is in fact a sort of opera, wherein the Buddha is the central figure of a vast cast of innumerable sorts of beings, all engaged in a series of grand speeches and gestures, in the course of which the Buddha progressively reveals his superior and indeed superlative transcendent understanding of the Dharma. It is a remarkable coincidence that the Lotus Sutra originated about the same time that Jesus taught the gospel in Galilee and Jerusalem, fulfilling much the same function in relation to Judaism. The cosmology of the Lotus Sutra is the cosmology of Buddhism, an extended horizontal dimension consisting of a virtual infinity of universes, galaxies, stars, planets, beings, and atoms, as a single plane of a vertically extended hierarchy of greater or lesser degrees of energy, sentience, suffering, wisdom, and power. Broadly, this vertical axis consists of the divine realm, the human realm, and the demonic realm. The whole system functions in accordance with the law of causality, or karma, and the principle of interdependent origination, or pratitya samutpada. This includes astronomical phenomena and luminous aerial cars, or palaces, time dilation, and traveling through higher dimensions of experience over vast epochs of time. Here gods and men interact. Just gonna have a glug of water, if you'll forgive me. I've been talking for 5 hours already today, so I'm losing my voice a little bit. The Buddha's teaching method is described as a stratagem or a skilled method, upaya, sometimes translated as skillful method, or skillful means, whereby an infinity of Buddhas throughout time seek to communicate the Dharma to suffering beings by the most effective means adapted to the strengths or limitations of the hearers themselves, thus creating the appearance of a great diversity of teachings, whereas there is in fact only one teaching and one method that leads to one singular end, supreme non-dual enlightenment, anuttara samyak sambodhi, which may be literally rendered as ultimate perfect wisdom. Dharma is like a universal rain, nourishing the diversity of beings everywhere in the multiverse without distinction. The Lotus Sutra declares that all methods are merely preparations for the path of the wisdom being, without which perfect wisdom and ultimate enlightenment cannot be experienced. There's someone at the entry. Yas, maybe you could take care of that. Moreover, the Buddha declares that ultimately all beings who aspire to enlightenment, even but for an instant, will experience complete and perfect enlightenment in accordance with the law of causality, or karma. Since every effect is the result of a cause, and every cause must therefore produce its correlative effect sooner or later. All possess the precious jewel of Buddha nature, the Tathagatagarbha, within themselves. And therefore, enlightenment itself is everyone's inherent own nature from the very beginning. Ultimately, ignorance and even nirvana itself are illusions. So that completes the recap. We'll carry on with Chapter 10, which is called True Teachers. Chapter 10 of the Lotus Sutra represents the second phase of development of the sutra, about 50 years after the first phase, represented by chapters 2 through 9. In this chapter, the Buddha addresses 80,000 great leaders headed by Medicine King Tathagata, the Sanskrit of which is Vaisajaraja. In a former life, this wisdom being vowed to heal the physical and mental infirmities of all beings, providing many efficacious remedies for monastics. Having heard something of the history of the Medicine Buddha, skeptics might object, how can we know that such a wisdom being ever lived? And if they did not exist, how can the cult of the Medicine Buddha be effective? The Tantrics will tell you that the historical biography of the Medicine Buddha is only his most exoteric or superficial aspect, so-called outer meaning. Tantra refers to 3 or 4 levels of meaning of Buddha's teachings: outer, inner, secret, and sometimes most secret, sometimes with slight variations in terminology, but fairly standardized, which refer to increasingly subtle and profound levels of understanding. Thus, the Medicine Buddha may be understood in different ways. The Medicine Buddha mythos, or archetype, may also be understood as a psychic egregore, to use a term deriving from the Western esoteric tradition. although I suspect there probably is a Tibetan equivalent term. If there's someone in the audience who's familiar with Tibetan Buddhism, maybe they can enlighten me on that point. An egregore is a complex of psychic energy that is built up because of the concentration and worship of countless numbers of living beings. This is not dissimilar from the Jungian notion of the archetype. It also has some resonances in the Chinese tradition, as I've recently learned by reading a wonderful book called Understanding the I Ching by Helmut Wilhelm and Richard Wilhelm, particularly in the second half. He gives it a marvelous summary of the traditional Chinese spiritual view in that book, which I do recommend. Mind is not merely an epiphenomenon of matter, but an influential reality in its own right. An idea that we also find in quantum physics, interestingly, without regard to questions of historicity. You may recall Buddhist texts make frequent reference to the six senses. This is compared to our five, the sixth sense being mind. That alone has a whole set of implications which are fundamental to Buddhism. And this is the inner meaning of the Medicine Buddha. The secret meaning of the Medicine Buddha is that the Medicine Buddha is an aspect, vector, mode, or ray of the Buddha archetype. The primordial, or emanation for that matter, is another term. The primordial Buddha paradigm that is the commonality of all Buddhas. The Buddhahood of Buddha-ness, if you like, which has been called Adi Buddha, primordial Buddha, and identified with Samantabhadra, the patron of the Lotus Sutra, and others. The primordial Buddha is not an historical being at all, but rather the abstract principle of Buddhahood itself. It represents the healing power of the Buddha archetype. This is the secret meaning. Finally, the most secret meaning of the Medicine Buddha is that it is the Buddha nature itself, and is thus identical with the very true self of every person. The fundamental nature of which is emptiness, or shunyata, or non-self-identity, or anicca. Paradoxically, the true self is no self, a statement that is only intelligible from the transdual perspective. And recently, if some of you may have attended we ended up doing a whole series of talks on the nature of the doctrine of self and no self in Buddhism, somewhat recently. 3 or 4 talks, as I recall. These different levels of meaning, while not mutually exclusive, progress toward ever-increasing ultimacy. Thus, the historical objection is moot. A similar line of argument applies to the Mahayana itself. The Hinayana is the outer meaning of the Dharma. The Mahayana is the inner meaning. The Vajrayana is the secret meaning of the Dharma. In addition, the Ekayana is the most secret meaning, also known as, in my exegesis, the Dharma transmission to the West, which I do identify with the Ekayana, which will only be completely realized with the manifestation of Shambhala in the 25th century era, of historical work of Dr. Alex Berzin. The great leaders consist of gods, dragon kings, nature spirits, yakshas and gandharvas, demigods or demons, asuras, large humanoid bird-like creatures or garudas, centaurs or kimnaras, great serpents or mahoragas, male and female monastics and lay devotees, and various types of seekers, including disciples, which is my translation of the Shravakayana, hermits, which is my translation of the Pratyeka Buddhayana, wisdom beings, which is my translation of Bodhisattvas, and Buddhas, subsuming the 3 paths. The Buddha reiterates that those who hear even one word of the Lotus Sutra, even for a moment, thus, well, I won't say that. I was going to say which includes everyone, therefore, in the audience, except technically we're not reading the Lotus Sutra proper. Never mind. So the Buddha reiterates that those who hear even one word of the Lotus Sutra, even for a moment in the presence of the Buddha or even after his final emancipation, will necessarily attain ultimate enlightenment. The Buddha recommends to the assembly that the Lotus Sutra should be regarded as the Buddha himself and worshipped to be reborn as wisdom beings in the evil human world of suffering. Thus, wisdom beings are able to be reborn where they will, as sons and daughters of the Buddha and keepers of the Dharma, destined to become Buddhas themselves, accomplishing the self-arising and spontaneous intuitive wisdom. Those who disparage the Lotus Sutra or its teachers or teachings will incur great demerit, whereas those who extol the Buddha and the Lotus Sutra will acquire great merit and even greater happiness. The Lotus Sutra, the Buddha declares, is the Supreme Sutra. And of course, that particular idea has been taken up by the Nichiren sect, who regard the Lotus Sutra as the Supreme Sutra. The Buddha says that, quote, "This sutra is the mystic, essential treasury of all Buddhas, which must not be distributed among or recklessly delivered to men," quote unquote, and the most difficult to believe and understand. Somewhat paradoxically, those who copy, keep, read, recite, worship, and preach the Lotus Sutra to others will be endowed by the Tathagata with his robe, a presumed reference to the story in the Pali Canon where the Buddha gives his robe to Mahakasyapa to indicate his role as the Buddha's successor as president of the First Buddhist Council. For the purposes of this discussion, we won't concern ourselves with whether that is or is not a historical fact. It doesn't really matter. From the perspective of the Lotus Sutra, it's an idea. The Tathagata will place his hand on their heads, in blessing presumably, perhaps also to inspire their minds. The Buddha recommends erecting a chaitya, a pagoda in which sutras are deposited for the Lotus Sutra, based on the doctrine that the Lotus Sutra is identical with the body of the Buddha, the Nirmanakaya. He asserts that wisdom beings may be both lay and ordained, male and female, and that those who, and particularly note that in particular, male and female, as those of you who have attended my talk on the status of women in ancient India and the Pali tradition, the Pali Canon does have a particularly vexed view of women, and that those who have heard, however, the Lotus Sutra specifically says bodhisattvas may be female. So we're beginning to see women's liberation, I guess, in the context of the Mahayana, which does have a much more liberal view of women than the Theravada or the so he asserts that wisdom beings may be both lay and ordained, male and female, and that those who have heard the Lotus Sutra are walking in the true bodhisattva way and close to attaining enlightenment, because, quote, "the perfect enlightenment of every bodhisattva all belongs to this sutra," quote unquote. The Lotus Sutra reveals the meaning of the skilled method of the Buddha and is the only sutra that reveals the complete and real truth to all aspirants of whatever path and school, including Hinayana, Mahayana, disciples, hermits, and wisdom beings. The teacher of the Lotus Sutra should develop a great, compassionate, gentle, and patient heart based on the realization of universal voidness or emptiness. The Buddha will send spiritual protectors and shapeshifters to attend to his teaching, and even cause such a teacher and his audience to experience visions of the true Buddha as a pure and luminous being under the right conditions. He will inspire such a teacher with the wisdom to teach the true Dharma. This further implies that the Buddha continues to be involved with the world, even though he exists beyond all worlds. Thus, he is not extinct in the sense of either being non-existent, which would be nihilism, or impersonal, which would be deism. Chapter 11, the Dharma UFO. That's a somewhat free translation of the title on my part. Suddenly an enormous stupa arises, Hurwitz has wells up, Cato has springs up, out of the earth and appears to hover in the sky. Anyone in the audience, who has attended my talk on Buddhism and the UFO phenomenon? Anyone? Okay. So this will be familiar to you in some respects. The sutra gives the dimensions of the stupa as 500 yojanas by 250 yojanas, roughly 2,000 by 1,000 miles. Assuming 4.1 miles equals 1 yojana, and that is very approximate. There is quite a wide range of interpretations of how long a yojana is. This would be about 2 million square miles, somewhat larger than the area of India, which is 1.3 million square miles. So we're talking continental size. Kern translates stupa as meteoric phenomenon, but the UFO association is obvious to us. It reaches as far as the abode of the four great kings, the dimension next above our own earth plane. Made of precious metals and adorned with stones, banners, flags, garlands, and jeweled bells, all sorts of beings, including the inhabitants of the realm of the 33 gods, which you may recall is the topmost realm of Mount Sumeru, pay homage to and extol the fragrant stupa. The stupa also speaks, interestingly. The Buddha identifies the stupa with the body of the Tathagata, the Dharmakaya, referred to in the Pali Canon. The whole story strongly suggests the story of the precious Dharma wheel that appears in the sky in the Pali Canon and is identified with the sovereignty of the Dharma in the Digha Nikaya, I believe. The Buddha's Ajna chakra, that is the chakra located in the center of the brain, emits a glow. Cato and the rest call it a ray signal, or information vector. Ray signal is his translation, information vector is my interpretation. And in all the directions, wherever the Buddha directs his concentrated attention, Buddhas appear in beautiful pure lands and Buddha fields, preaching the Lotus Sutra with ravishing voices, innumerable as the sands of the Ganges. These Buddhas are all emanations of the primary Buddha archetype, and appear as hidden dimensions of ordinary space-time, or samsara. All of these Buddhas pay homage to Siddhartha Gautama on Vulture Peak, and the precious stupa in this world of suffering, which is also transformed into a beautiful Pure Land. The assembled Buddhas entreat the Buddha to open the stupa, who rises into the air and opens the door of the stupa, which makes a great sound, quote, with the fingers of his right hand, unquote, wherein they all behold the intact body of the Tathagata abundant treasures, or many jewels. His name is Prabhu Taratna, identified with the Dharmakaya or reality body of the Buddha himself, seated in meditation in the ancient archetypal cross-legged posture that goes back to Indus Valley civilization between the 3rd and 2nd millennia before the Common Era. The Buddha enters the stupa and also sits in cross-legged posture, whereupon the whole assembly rises into the sky to join them and hear the teachings. So the subsequent teachings do take place in what is, for all intents and purposes, a UFO, as I've suggested by the title. Chapter 12, Devadatta. Chapter 11 of the Lotus Sutra, named after the Buddha's wicked cousin and brother-in-law Devadatta, is included in Chapter 11 of the Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan versions of the Sutra. And Kumar Jiva's version divides Chapter 11 into 2 chapters, hence Chapter 12. The Buddha says that he sought the Lotus Sutra throughout vast ages of time as a righteous king. A hermit, Asita by name, came to him and offered to teach him the Lotus Sutra, whereas the king accepted the hermit as his guru. This is in a past life, of course. Asita, the Buddha says, was none other than Devadatta. Devadatta was a Buddhist monk and the cousin and brother-in-law of the Buddha, and the brother of Ananda. Devadatta was Kolian. He split from the Buddha's community with 500 other monks to form their own Sangha, which interestingly has now been, this used to be regarded as a somewhat mythological idea. More recent scholarship suggests that, in fact, Buddhism recognized multiple teachers even though it was all referred to as Buddhism, of course that's our translation, but that the Buddha was not the only recognized teacher of what we call the Buddhist tradition. And Devadatta was one of these alternative teachers, and his sect actually survived the Buddha by several centuries. I think I've read, talking off the top of my head now, I've read two different dates for the longevity of Devadatta's Sangha. I think I've read 4th century and also 7th century as alternative dates for how long Devadatta's group survived. The Buddhist tradition, of course, has its own take on Devadatta, based on the Pali tradition. Most of these are said to have been Shakyan relatives of both Devadatta and Siddhartha. Devadatta became self-righteous. He began to think that only he and not the Buddha should lead the Sangha. Shortly afterward, Devadatta asked the Buddha to retire and let him run the Sangha. The Buddha retorted that he would not even let his trusted disciples Sariputra or Moggallana run the Sangha, much less one like Devadatta, quote, who should be vomited like spittle, unquote. The Buddha warned the monks that Devadatta had changed for the worse. Seeing the danger in this, Devadatta approached Prince Ajatashatru and encouraged him to kill his father, the good king Bimbisara. Meanwhile, Devadatta would kill the Buddha. Devadatta then tried to murder the Buddha himself by pushing a rock down on him while the Buddha was walking on the slopes of a mountain. When this failed, he got the elephant Nalagiri drunk and sicked the enraged elephant on the Buddha while the Buddha was at alms round. However, the Buddha's loving kindness, or metta, was so great that it overcame the elephant's anger. Devadatta then tried to create a schism in the order. This, as I said, is the Pali interpretation. He collected a few monastic friends and demanded that the Buddha accept the following rules for the monks: that they should live all their lives in the forest, live entirely in alms obtained by begging, wear only robes made of discarded rags, dwell at the foot of trees, and abstain entirely from fish and flesh. In other words, Devadatta was more fundamentalist, literalist, and extreme than Siddhartha was, or is represented as being. The Buddha allowed the monastics to follow all of these except the last if they wished. The Buddha refused to make any of these rules compulsory, however, and Devadatta went about saying that the Buddha was living in abundance and luxury, similar to the accusation made by the group of 5 before the Buddha's enlightenment, and an accusation which actually dogged the Buddha throughout his life. Devadatta then created a schism and recited the training rules, the Patimokkha, apart from the Buddha and his followers, with 500 novices. The Buddha sent his 2 chief disciples, Sariputra and Maudgalyayana, to bring back the erring young monks. Devadatta thought they had come to join his Sangha. After asking Sariputra to give a Dharma talk, he went to bed. When he awoke, he discovered that the chief disciples had persuaded the young monks to return to the Buddha. Oh, and here I do see a footnote that I've added. Devadatta's Sangha did, according to at least one authority, survived until the 7th century of the Common Era, although I think I've also seen 4th century as well. Often Buddhist dates are not consistent between different scholars. The Buddha predicts that even Devadatta will become a Buddha. Considering Devadatta's antipathy for Siddhartha in this life, the identification of Devadatta with the source of the Lotus Sutra and the Buddha's prediction that he will become a Buddha are both remarkable. In fact, they're reminiscent of, in another context, of if anyone's heard of the Judas Gospel, or the Gospel of Judas in the Christian Gnostic tradition. It's a very, very similar interpretation of the role of Judas in the life of Jesus, as we find here. Very much parallel. The story reminds one of the... once again, I have anticipated myself. The story reminds one of the Gnostic Christian books, especially the Gospel of Judas, in which Judas is represented as the positive agent of the salvific principle. And Jules knows all about it. Is familiar with it. The demonic... it's a wonderful gospel, actually. There's also a TV program about it. that you can watch. I think BBC did a program on the Gospel of Judas. The demonic or satanic principle is somehow essential for salvation, an idea which we also find in Theosophy, as we discussed in the talk I did on Theosophy at the Gnostic Sanctuary some time ago. Thus, in Tantra, evil is transformed by mental power into a force for good. The Lotus Sutra is subtly indicating its identity with an antinomian tendency that we find also in the Gnostics and in the Sufis and in William Blake, and probably many others as well, but those are the three that occurred to me in the context of reading the Lotus Sutra. Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, predicts that the 8-year-old daughter of the Dragon King, Samara, will become a Buddha, thus discountenancing the misogyny of the Pali Canon and earlier passages of the Lotus Sutra itself. Sariputra, defending the old view, challenges Manjushri's assertion that a woman can become a Buddha. Quote, "The body of a woman is filthy and not a vessel of the law. How can she attain supreme Bodhi?" Unquote. With apologies to any women in the audience. Presenting a pearl to the Buddha, the dragon's daughter transforms herself into a male Buddha and realizes instantaneous enlightenment. Next, that concludes chapter 12. Now for chapter 13, enthusiasm. The Medicine King Buddha in great eloquence vow to keep, read, recite, and preach the Lotus Sutra through the evil age to come, that is, the present epoch, characterized by arrogance and greed. The whole assembly vows to do the same. The Buddha predicts the future enlightenment of his foster mother, Mahapajapati, and his wife, Yasodhara. And that's all I have to say about chapter 13. Those of you who attended the opening talk, you may recall, I'm focusing in this series of talks on meaning in the Lotus Sutra, and I am not focusing so much on plot or characters or symbols, which is why some of these chapters are somewhat leaner than others. Trying to counteract the scholarly tendency to emphasize the superficial aspects of the sutra and not so much meaning or content. Chapter 14, the happy way. Manjushri asks the Buddha how the Lotus Sutra is to be taught. The Buddha replies that he is to live in the place where the wisdom being acts, characterized by 4 methods: the way of the body, the way of speech, the way of mind, and the way of the vow, each of which we will discuss in turn, beginning with the way of the body. The way of the body consists of ethical behavior. One follows the middle path between realism or eternalism and nihilism, avoiding discrimination and worldly people and activities, and infatuation with women, as well as pandakas, one of the 4 genders recognized in Buddhism, and teaching Dharma without any expectation of reward. The precise English translation of pandaka is obscure. Hurwitz translates the word as unmanly men, though he acknowledges that the literal meaning of the word is impotent, referring specifically to inability or disinterest in performing sexually with women. Cato and Kern have hermaphrodite. The Pali English Dictionary has eunuch or weakling. Hurwitz states that homosexuals were included in this group. This condition of being impotent with women includes asexuality, full or partial impotence, whether psychological or physical, premature ejaculation, voyeurism, and fellatio. And Yospe says, is that inability or disinterest, since it seems to be a big difference? Well, it's like I said, it's a somewhat obscure term which has multiple interpretations. So, if you were going to answer that question, you would want to find every reference to Pandaka in the Buddhist scriptures, or at least in the Pali Canon, study the context, and then come to a conclusion, which represents a level of scholarship which goes beyond my feeble powers. And possibly someone's discussed this, a written article on this, possibly, so you might find something on that very question. But basically, the term has multiple interpretations and is obscure. All such persons were prohibited from joining the Sangha. The reference to having desire to rear or keep a young disciple or novice, however, suggests that homoerotic attraction was far from unknown to the celibate all-male Sangha, and it certainly was. It's far from unknown in the Sangha, the historical Sangha, over the centuries following the Buddha. Very much the opposite, in fact. Rather, one should concentrate on the Buddha and meditate in a quiet place. Sort of like taking a cold shower. Further, the wisdom being should regard all phenomena as empty or void, seeing things as they really are, namely not moving. A cutting-edge theory of modern post-quantum physics regards the universe as static, the illusion of change being the result of the dynamism of conscious intention or the active observation. That's discussed in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, in the entry on quantum physics. Like space, beyond linguistic labeling, and therefore transrational, illusory, infinite, ubiquitous, and the result of causes, or karma and conditions. Next, the way of speech. A wisdom being should be friendly and tolerant and constructive rather than destructive. In a passage reminiscent of the Tao Te Ching, the Lotus Sutra says, quote, "It is because one is skilled at cultivating such comfortable thoughts as these that one's listeners shall not oppose one's intentions." Quote unquote. Next, the way of mind. The wisdom being teaches the Dharma with perfect equanimity, inducing others to hear, observe, recite, teach, copy, and honor the sutra with others. And finally, the way of the vow. Finally, they should manifest bodhicitta, the bodhisattva vow, whereby one generates the intention to attain Buddhahood and teach the Dharma out of compassion for all beings and thus bring all beings to emancipation. The Buddha identifies the Lotus Sutra with a bright pearl in the top knot of a sage king. Compare Plato's philosopher kings, or for that matter, Lao Tzu's concept of the sage ruler. The wise king only gives the crown jewel to his chosen ones. Pearl is clearly a symbol of the Sahasrara chakra at the crown of the head. Similarly, the Lotus Sutra presents the Buddha's highest teaching. Taoism and Buddhism see the pearl as a symbol of spiritual awareness or enlightenment. Pearl in the center of the lotus blossom symbolizes the ultimate wisdom in life, and pearls are associated with the dragon energy in Asian folklore. Pearls also represent the full moon, prominent in Buddhist symbolism. In the Avatamsaka Sutra, metaphor of Indra's net represents reality as a web or network wherein a pearl is tied into every knot in the web. Pearls represent the totality of all possibilities, where each pearl is connected to every other pearl through an infinite web symbolizing the infinite interconnectedness of all phenomena. That is, of course, imagination. Moreover, the surface of every pearl is like a mirror, reflecting all other pearls in the web. Jesus, of course, refers to in a parable to the pearl of great price that represents the kingdom of heaven. Interestingly, the next parable in the Gospel refers to a net. The wise king achieves the Dharma by means of the combination of meditative concentration and wisdom, teaches the sutras, and confers on his followers such precious gifts as meditation, emancipation, which is my translation of nirvana, faultless roots and powers, quote-unquote. Hurwitz has faculties without outflows, quote-unquote, and psychic powers. Cato has all the wealth of the law, culminating in nirvana. Implicitly, the Lotus Sutra, the secret treasure house of the Tathagatas, quote-unquote, and the source of the title of my book, The Treasure House of Secrets, is identified with the pearl representing the highest teaching of the Buddha, through which all beings can achieve perfect wisdom. So it's 10 to 5 now, and I have completed chapter 14, which is the official endpoint for today's talk, but I'm happy to go on with another chapter. Chapter 15, the wisdom beings emerge out of the earth, which is pretty interesting in the context of the UFO chapter we just read. Or I can take some questions if anyone has any questions or comments. What would you prefer? Do you want me to go on? Or do you have questions or comments? We have 10 minutes. If no one gives Tesla and says yes, I did, of course, give you two alternatives there. Jospa says, perhaps it is good to extrapolate on that idea of non-dual enlightenment. What would be dual enlightenment? I don't know what dual enlightenment would be. I think the phrase non-dual enlightenment simply is referring to the nature of enlightenment as being non-dual. I don't think it's set up a contrast with dual enlightenment, although I suppose one could set up a contrast with the Pali view, as expressed, for example, by Bhikkhu Bodhi in his essay on duality and non-duality, which he wrote in the late 1990s, in which he opined that there is no evidence at all in the Pali Canon of any suggestion of any idea of non-duality. According to Bhikkhu Bodhi, who is, of course, a Theravadan, especially was, less so now, that he's become involved with the Chinese Mahayana monastery and has started attending talks by the Dalai Lama. But in the 90s, he was very strongly Theravadan, and he held the view quite strongly that Buddhism is inherently dualistic. So I suppose that could be the dual enlightenment, the theory, the Theravadan view of enlightenment is dual, posits duality. I think there are many references to non-duality throughout the Pali Canon personally, and I've summarized them somewhere in one of my talks. Yospe says, was this also in early Buddhism a schism? What? Non-duality? The theory of non-duality? Oh yes, definitely. This was the beginning, well, the Lotus Sutra, certainly. The Lotus Sutra, although it is a Prakrit Sutra, written in language similar to Pali and is imbued with references to the Pali tradition, is a Mahayana Sutra, and certainly from the perspective of contemporary Hinayana, which we call the Theravada, Mahayana is a schism. You may recall from my talk on the early Buddhist scriptures, I can't remember, I'm just trying to remember the title of the talk. The early Buddhist tradition, I can't remember exactly, but the Hinayana tradition itself involved multiple schools, traditionally 18 or I think 21, and about half of those schools held to traditional view that we would associate with Theravada. The other half were beginning to speculate, question traditional views, and began slowly to move towards the Mahayana without actually becoming Mahayana. So Mahayana, as I've mentioned in other talks, did not originate as a rejection of Hinayana so much as an evolution of Hinayana. Although from contemporary Theravada perspective, they are perceived or presented as being antithetical, historically it was a development. And in fact, Mahayana and Hinayana monastics lived together in the same monasteries for a period of time, and the only difference, and therefore presumably got along with each other. The only difference being that the Hinayana monastics studied the Pali texts, Mahayana monastics studied the Pali texts and the Mahayana Sutras, which are all filled with references to the Pali tradition. So it's not that the Mahayana rejected the Pali tradition so much as developed as a result, one might suggest, depending on one's perspective, as a result of Buddhist practice, enlightenment, developed a larger, more imaginative, more speculative, more liberal interpretation or understanding of the Dharma, as opposed to the more backward-looking, historical, fundamentalist, and literalistic perspective of what we now call the Theravada. Any other comments, questions? We have 5 minutes. I'm happy to do one more chapter if people want to. It might go, it's 1, 2, 3, 4.25 pages. It might go over 5, it might go somewhat past 5 o'clock. Let's do it. Okay. Chapter 15, the wisdom beings emerge out of the earth. In this prelude to chapter 16, chapter 15 of the Sanskrit edition, in which the essential teaching of the Lotus Sutra is finally plainly revealed, the assembled wisdom beings enthusiastically offer to teach the Lotus Sutra to others. However, the Buddha spurns their offer, declaring that the so-called originally converted bodhisattvas, quote-unquote, are chosen messengers who alone can teach the Lotus Sutra in the future. These mysterious wisdom beings have been personally taught and trained by the Buddha and are countless in number. At that moment the earth shakes and is split asunder by earthquakes, and out of the great clefts that open up in the ground there appear vast numbers of luminous bodhisattvas of the earth, quote-unquote, that rise up and ascend to the same great aerial stupa that we encountered in chapter 11. This recalls the illusion of the Buddha's earth-touching gesture when he appeals to the Deva of the earth in response to Mara's challenge to prove the fact of his enlightenment. It is also impossible to ignore the ufological implication of this description, and it's ironic that we're doing this series of talks right now on the verge of the Pentagon in the United States issuing what may be a very revealing official report on the UFO phenomenon, which they have already acknowledged as being real. 4 wisdom beings lead the bodhisattvas of the earth. They are superior practices, the leader, boundless practices, pure practices, and firmly established practices, which have been interpreted in various ways. The great Japanese reformer Nichiren, who lived between 1222 and 1282, identified himself with superior practices, as is rebirth, whose Sanskrit name is Vishishtacharitra. The wisdom beings that rise out of the earth take their seats cross-legged all around the Buddha. The Buddha declares Maitreya to be the next Buddha. The Sanskrit version of the text refers to the Buddha's manliness, a word which we've discussed in previous talks, virya, which also is often translated energy, and which correlates, interestingly, in the Tao Te Ching to the concept of the complement of Tao. The Buddha tells the assembly that the wisdom beings that emerge out of the earth inhabit a vast open space within the earth, sahasir. Here we see a possible archaic origin for the hollow earth theory. This is a universal idea found in mythology, folklore, and legends, including Kabbalah and Tibetan Buddhism, where it takes the form of Agartha. The inner earth is a reputed location of Shambhala. In Greek lore, an ancient god called Zalmoxis inhabited these interior caverns. According to Celtic lore, there is a cave in Station Island called Chuachan that leads to the lower realms, also known as St. Patrick's Purgatory. The Tuatha De Danann, who introduced Druidism to Ireland, also emerged out of the interior earth through a cave in County Down. Other similar sites include the north side of the Missouri River, whence the Mandan people are said to have originated, Cedar Creek, near the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation, and the Red River above the junction of the Mississippi River. The Cedar Creek caverns were shown to Leclerc Milford, a French military officer and adventurer, by the Creek Indians in 1781, who declared that there was room there for 15 or 20,000 families. Hopi tradition refers to a similar cave in the Grand Canyon. Incas have a tradition of such a cave east of Cusco, Peru. Many ancient peoples believed that their ancestors came out of the interior of the earth. Many believe that they still exist. Edmund Halley, or Halley, I think his name is pronounced Halley actually, Edmund Halley, after whom Halley's Comet is named, proposed that the earth is hollow in 1692. Some traditions identify the interior inhabitants as devilish. The interior earth has more recently been proposed as the source of the UFO phenomenon. Astronomer and computer scientist Dr. Jacques Vallée in particular has suggested that the UFO phenomenon is actually terrestrial in origin. W. Holliday's Goblin Universe idea, popularized by Colin Wilson, may also be included here. If one looks at the imaginative interpretation of the hollow earth hypothesis in fiction, it seems to be associated with inversion, archaism, high technology, secret knowledge, spirituality, alien life, and utopianism. The hollow earth meme may be a psychological projection of a reality that is a larger, more profound interpretation than the physical theory. It could also be regarded as an allegory or a metaphor for the idea that there are multiple earth planes and that there are intelligent beings who inhabit those planes who are technically associated with the earth but intangible or invisible to us. Once again, recalling the UFO phenomenon. We need not take these mythologisms literally to take them seriously. It is easy to see in the midst of the open space of this sphere, quote unquote, modern scientific conceptions of multi-dimensionality, once again I've anticipated myself, in which various numbers and types of dimensions beyond the ordinary 4 dimensions are concealed within our experience of materiality, as well as multi-universes that may coexist but be invisible and intangible to us. The Jungian in me cannot help but notice too that these higher beings are also interior beings. That modern science is openly speculating about such things is remarkable confirmation of the primordial wisdom of our ancient ancestors, whose worldview is so similar to ours even after thousands of years of aberration that persists in the incredibly shallow and naive view of reality that pervades religion, politics, industry, and even science today, so-called scientism. The perennial philosophy is both protean and perdurable. The incredulous assembly, deluded by historicism, objects that the Buddha has only been enlightened for 40 years, quoting the age at which he taught the Lotus Sutra at 75, 5 years before his passing on, at the age of 80. How therefore can he have trained so many wisdom beings? They beg the Buddha to explain, so they do not doubt. This is the moment of consciousness expansion that everyone has been waiting for. The prelude to the essential teaching of the Lotus Sutra, which we will discuss in the next chapter. And that is a perfect place to stop this week, so we will carry that on next Monday at 1 o'clock Second Life time. Before we, and it is only 3 after, so that worked out perfectly. Before we all beings. Does anyone have any other questions or comments or discussion? Thank you, Jules. Absolutely, Yas. Go ahead. Promote away. Yospa says, since I was unable to write a new one, and for those who missed it, I will repeat. In religions and philosophies, as well as contemporary beliefs, the number 7 has found a rather exceptional fame. Why is this? Yospa will present this topic once more. This talk comes with some, my thing disappeared. This talk comes with some personal stories and some unexpected 7s. At the Gnostic Sanctuary Mansion on Silent, Tuesday, June 1, at 1 p.m. Second Lifetime, 45 minutes, voice, question and answer, discussion among attendees very welcome. And I can mention, since we're talking about future talks, I've in the very early stages of starting a talk, a 1 hour talk probably, on the I Ching, which I'm just in the beginning stages of and have just finished reading and studying the I Ching by the Wilhelm Lectures on the Book of Changes by Helmut Wilhelm and Richard Wilhelm, as I mentioned. So that may be ready in some point in the future. A few weeks, maybe a month or two. I can't really say when it'll be ready, but when it is ready, I'll be presenting it to the group as well. The I Ching is very interesting. Any other comments, questions, or discussion before we conclude with dedication of merit? Looks like not, so thank you very much for that. Let me just post it in the chat, and feel free to join me in this. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you once again for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is, as always, my pleasure and privilege. I will see you here next week at 1 p.m. Second Lifetime. Namaskar.